Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We will be starting very shortly, about another minute or so. Okay, thank you everybody for joining us. We will get started. My name is Erica Nowakowski. I'm the Associate Director for the Tau Youth Justice Institute. We're happy to be kicking off our 2022 Fact versus Fiction webinar. Today's focus is reinforcing successful juvenile reform for safer and healthier communities. We will be holding two or three more of these Fact versus Fiction webinar throughout the spring. One of them will be focused on unmet mental health and educational needs of children. Our second one will be focused on, or our third, I should say, will be focused on Connecticut's juvenile justice current legislative agenda for juvenile justice. Our vision at the Tau Youth Justice Institute is for a state in which youth serving agencies are consistently using best practices to create positive opportunities so that our children, families, and communities are safe, healthy, and resourceful. Connecticut has made significant strides in improving the juvenile justice system. Connecticut has led to safer and healthier communities while maintaining public safety. You will hear today from national experts around the best practices in the juvenile justice system. We are so grateful to have a panel of national experts: Marc Schindler, Executive Director of the Justice Policy Institute, who will also be our moderator; Michael Umpierre, Director of the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform; Lael Chester, Director of Emerging Adults Justice Project at Columbia University Justice Lab; Tiana Davis, Policy Director for Equity and Justice at the Center for Children's Law and Policy; Clinton Lazy, President and CEO of the Credible Messengers Mentoring Movement. And now I will give the floor to Marc Schindler.
Great. Thank you, Erica. Really appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to be here with all of you today. As Erica said, my name is Marc Schindler. I'm Executive Director of the Justice Policy Institute based in Washington, and I have the honor of moderating this really terrific panel today. You're going to hear from a number of folks from around the country, national experts, and people who have done this work on the ground. They're going to bring their perspectives on the juvenile justice system generally, as well as issues related to what's being discussed in Connecticut around various issues related to the juvenile justice system there. As Erica said, we've got a terrific lineup of speakers. And before we jump into the discussion, I just want to provide some opening comments to set the context a little bit of background, and then we'll go to comments from our panelists and discussion. We'll also have time at the end for Q&A, and we encourage folks who are joined in to place questions in the chat, which we'll be doing our best to get to. So again, thanks for joining us. So by way of background and to provide some context for today's conversation, in 2007, as I think many of you probably know, Connecticut made national headlines when it passed a law ending its status as one of just 3 states nationally that automatically tried and punished all 16 and 17-year-olds as adults. This historic raise the age legislation, though, was just one of many reforms enacted by Connecticut's juvenile justice system over the years. Connecticut was such a leader in their overall reforms that my organization, the Justice Policy Institute, which is a national research and policy organization, decided that we would conduct research about Connecticut's reforms as we thought it was useful to look at more closely and also to share it with others around the country. So we did so with publication of a report in 2013, which was shared with jurisdictions around the country. I believe you'll be able to see that report. Well, you can see that report on our website at www.justicepolicy.org. And I think it's also will be made available in the chat during this webinar. I'll also note that we published a subsequent report on a handful of jurisdictions around the country that had raised the age of jurisdiction, including Connecticut. And so we did that to also share lessons learned from those experiences to encourage other states considering raising the age of jurisdiction in their own states, that there was a safe and effective way to do so, similar to how Connecticut did it. But I want to talk today a little bit about our findings from our 2013 report before opening it up to further discussion. That report concluded that Connecticut had transformed what had previously been a wasteful, ineffective, and often abusive juvenile justice system into a system that could, in many ways, be viewed as a national model. Still work to be done, as there always is, but the progress was significant. And perhaps more than any other state at that time, Connecticut had absorbed the growing body of knowledge and research about youth development and delinquency and adopted those lessons. The state and its leaders had used the information to fundamentally reinvent its approach to juvenile justice. And as a result, our research showed that Connecticut's system was more successful, more humane, and more cost-effective than it had been prior to those reform efforts. So I want to quickly just share some of the key findings from our research and that 2013 report. First, Connecticut had substantially reduced its over-reliance on confinement, saving money and investing in more community-based options. Second, and related, Connecticut had built a continuum of targeted, high-quality, non-residential programs and services for youth. Specifically, we saw that Connecticut had developed a vast array of new community-based supervision and treatment programs, and that the state had expanded its investment in evidence-based, family-focused adolescent treatment programs with proven success in reducing problem behaviors. The investment at that time was substantial, going from around $300,000 in those types of programs in 2000 to about $39 million in 2009, an incredible increase. Third, during this time, Connecticut had also substantially improved its conditions in its juvenile facilities. That has to be ongoing work, as we know, but there had been significant progress. The state had also diverted status offending youth, those kids who were involved in truancy, running away from home, and alcohol possession, those types of offenses. They had diverted many of those kids from the court system and out of locked detention centers. The state had moved to actually eliminate admission of youth to detention centers for status offenses and open family support centers statewide to offer community-based programming. And we found that after those reforms had been implemented, the number of youth with status offenses who were rearrested or convicted of crimes fell by more than 70%. So very substantial progress. As I mentioned, the reforms in keeping youth out of the adult system were very noteworthy, and the number of youth prosecuted and housed in adult facilities dropped very substantially. We found that Connecticut's raising the age had increased juvenile caseloads far less than expected. As a result, the state had actually spent nearly $12 million less in fiscal years 2010 and 11 than it had budgeted for. And that 16-year-olds served by the juvenile system had higher success rates in alternative programs and lower rearrest rates than youth 15 and younger, essentially disproving concerns that they should be in the adult system. Connecticut also was making efforts at the time to more seriously address racial and ethnic disparities in the juvenile justice system in the state. They couldn't claim statewide progress at that point, but there was a much more serious effort beginning to look at those issues. And finally, Connecticut reduced the arrests of youth at school for routine and non-serious misbehavior. So they were starting to close what is often referred to as the school to prison pipeline. In one pilot district, arrests and expulsions fell both by more than 60% compared to the prior year. So very impressive reforms taking place. And essentially the bottom line that we found was that Connecticut had realized substantial cost savings and improved public safety at the time going through these reforms. The overall spending on juvenile justice, adjusted for inflation, had not increased despite the implementation of many new programs and services. And the state's juvenile crime rate had dropped considerably, even as confinement rates plummeted. So all very, very positive. As part of our report at that time, we thought it was important to share with other jurisdictions some key elements of how Connecticut achieved that progress. And you can see that in that report. I just want to highlight a couple. One, there was a commitment by the state to using evidence-based and research-based treatment models and other promising practices validated by research. There was also a commitment and implementation of a statewide juvenile justice strategic planning process that was implemented. Lots of outreach to folks in the community, to key stakeholders, to get input and, as importantly, to get buy-in to the overall reform efforts. Also, private philanthropic support was a key element. Since the 90s, the Tao Foundation particularly had provided substantial grants to support juvenile justice reform efforts statewide, including direct services, research and advocacy, and other foundations, both within and outside Connecticut, also joined in and provided invaluable assistance. So those were some of the ways that they had gone about how to operationalize these reforms. And finally, we shared a couple of key lessons in looking at the reforms that had taken place that we wanted other jurisdictions to take note of. And I just want to highlight one of them. Again, you can look at the report online, you can see more detail, but the one that I want to highlight today that we said at the time was that there needed to be a commitment for the long haul. Connecticut learned during those processes that the challenges to reform never end. Creating and maintaining an effective research-based juvenile justice system requires a continuing quality improvement process, a thirst for improvement and innovation. And even with all that the Connecticut's reforms have accomplished over the years, we noted that those efforts were continuing. And I would urge, as we kick off the conversation today, and you'll hear from folks who have had experiences in reforms around the country, I would urge all of us to think about what the commitment needs to be to continue these types of reforms and progress, and recognizing that it's hard work, which in reality is never done, and that inevitably there will be bumps in the road. And we see that in jurisdictions around the country. So again, just some ways to think about this in terms of setting the context. And I'm really pleased now to be able to turn to our panelists to follow up and kick off this discussion. I'm going to start first with Michael Umpierre. Michael is the director of the Georgetown Center for Juvenile Justice Reform, also based in Washington. I will note that I had the honor of working with Michael years ago when he and I served in leadership positions with Washington, D.C.'s Juvenile Justice Agency. Michael's going to talk a little bit about research that his organization has conducted and how it applies to this conversation, including talking about publication of an important report that they issued in 2019 called A Roadmap to the Ideal Juvenile Justice System. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Michael. Welcome your comments, and we'll go from there.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark, and hello, everyone. As Mark mentioned, I'm Michael Umpierre. I'm the director of the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform. We are a research center housed within the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. And our mission is to improve the lives of young people, families, and community members touched by the justice system or at risk of touching the justice system. And we do this through a combination of research, training, and technical assistance programs that we offer, designed to translate the research on what works to achieve positive outcomes for kids, for families, and communities into practical tools that practitioners and system leaders can use to shape their juvenile justice policy and practice. And since our organization's inception in 2007, we've worked with literally hundreds of communities across the United States, including Connecticut, around juvenile justice system reform and enhancements, including by taking a special focus on how the justice system can work collaboratively with youth serving agencies and systems to serve young people in a more collaborative and holistic fashion. Mark, thanks so much for setting the context of the incredible progress and work that's taken place in Connecticut. It's important to have that history in mind and to recognize all of the achievements that have taken place in the state as we continue to chart the path forward in Connecticut. And I want to thank the Tau Youth Justice Institute for inviting me to speak, for convening this incredible panel, and for hosting this really important conversation. For those of you who know our work at the center, we think a lot about what it means to shape effective juvenile justice policy and practice. And for us, we always begin the conversation around outcomes. The outcomes that we seek to achieve and the outcomes that we are likely to achieve based on research and based on data. And as leaders think about the progress in Connecticut and the path forward in Connecticut, going back to the outcomes really is essential, because research and data really should be guiding the way as we think about how we move forward. Now, fortunately, for all of us who work in the juvenile justice field, the reality is that at this moment in time, we know more about what works to achieve positive youth, family, and community outcomes than ever before in history. The body of knowledge in our field is deep, it's compelling, and it's clear in terms of the path that we need to head down in order to get those outcomes that we care about, whether that's increased public safety, increased community safety, improved youth or family outcomes around critical domains like education, employment, health, or well-being, or other indicators. The question is not whether the research is there. It is. The question is whether we, as system leaders and partners, including the folks in Connecticut, will continue to take that research and actually apply it to shape our juvenile justice policies, our practices, and approaches. And so this is a constant source of conversation of ours at the center in our work with communities all across the United States. And as Mark mentioned, a few years ago, we decided to take on this task of conceptualizing what an ideal juvenile justice system would look like, right? One that was effective at achieving those positive youth, family, and community outcomes that I just mentioned. So we examined the research, we looked at best practices, we talked with folks in the field, including like many of our webinar attendees today, and we developed a framework that we think is useful in terms of thinking about juvenile justice policy and practice, really emanating from that research and from that data. And we developed a set of operating fundamental principles that really should be at the heart of our work in juvenile justice. As Mark mentioned, we called this the roadmap to the ideal juvenile justice system. And if I could ask Shantae to share the slide, I'd like for you all to see the operating principles here as I talk about them further. The publication, as you see here, linked at the bottom there, is on our website at the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform. So you see the hyperlink there, cjjr.georgetown.edu/resources/publications. And again, it's the roadmap to the ideal juvenile justice system. It was authored by Tim Decker. Many of you may know Mr. Decker, who was the former director of both the juvenile justice and child welfare agencies in Missouri. And the paper was developed collaboratively with our Juvenile Justice Leadership Network. This is a national group of some of the most effective juvenile justice agency directors across the country at the state and county levels. So again, this was a body of research that many folks contributed to, building off of the data, building off of the body of knowledge that we have, building off of our experience all across the country. And this ultimately are the various operating principles of that ideal juvenile justice system. I won't have time to go into great depth into each one of these. I just have a few minutes to speak. We have wonderful other speakers that we want to hear from as well. So I'll be brief here and we can talk more as the conversation unfolds. But right at the outset, I did want to note that one of the core principles of effective juvenile justice policy and practice is this notion of really shaping developmentally appropriate approaches. We have to recognize in our work the differences between young people and adults, accounting for the science on brain development and adolescent development. We know that the brain continues to develop well into the mid-20s, and research is clear that as the brain is developing, adolescents are less able to regulate their own behavior, particularly in emotionally charged contexts. They're more sensitive to external influence like peer pressure and immediate rewards. And they have less future orientation, right? Less ability to appreciate the consequences of one's actions, particularly in those emotionally charged environments. And so we have to take all of that into account when we're shaping our juvenile justice approaches. And we know our outcomes will be better if we do. This is not to say that we don't hold young people accountable when they commit offenses or misbehave, but it does mean we have to appreciate the impact of youth development and really support the process of youth development. And if we're really concerned about public safety as a primary outcome, then it really is incumbent, it really is imperative that we invest in fully developmental approaches, because the research shows that we will improve public safety if we're able to do that. One seminal piece of research in this regard is the meta-analysis that Dr. Marc Lipsey and his colleagues conducted many years ago at Vanderbilt University, which looked at over 500 studies at the time of juvenile justice interventions and programs. Ultimately, Dr. Lipsey and his team wanted to know what was common among the programs that were effective at improving public safety. What was it? Was there a common link between those types of interventions? And in fact, the central finding from that really important study, this meta-analysis, was that those programs, those approaches that were steeped in a therapeutic developmental philosophy, right? Those that focused on skill development, on positive relationships between young people and caring adults, on restorative justice, that those types of approaches were much more likely to reduce recidivism than those programs that were steeped in punishment, that were steeped in control, in surveillance, and fear. And so this is a really critically important finding for our work in juvenile justice, because it's a reminder that young people are developing, that as a nature of development, there will be setbacks. And yet we have to recognize that, we have to meet the needs of young people in a holistic way in order to promote public safety. So with any proposal, any legislative proposal, any policy proposal, we have to be going back to asking the question, is it promoting youth development? And if it's not, then we are not positioning ourselves to achieve the outcomes that we care about. Secondly, here, we see that in everything that we do, we have to ask the question, as Marc mentioned, is it research-based? Are we really leveraging data and the knowledge that we have in a way to increase the likelihood of the outcomes that we seek? So we have to double down on data collection and analysis and really looking at research. And again, in policy proposals and thinking about moving forward, we always have to ask the question, is the research there? What does the data show? and really let that guide our way moving forward. Fairness and equity is another critically important principle of juvenile justice. We know that this is not just the right thing to do in terms of ensuring that every young person and family member experiences the justice system in an equitable way, but our outcomes are actually linked to that, right? So when we think about procedural due process and procedural fairness, research, that body of research, it's clear that young people, when they experience systems that they perceive to be fair, they're much more likely to engage with system officials. They're much more likely to build trust. They're much more likely to accept consequences of their actions. And so fairness and equity, it's not just the right thing to do. It's our outcomes are better if we can shape our systems. Now, unfortunately, as Marc mentioned, young people of color in particular continue to face disparate treatment in practically every jurisdiction in the country. And so it remains one of the most wicked problems that our justice system faces, but one that we have to overcome in order to achieve the outcomes that we seek. A strengths-based approach, again, speaking to this notion of a therapeutic, positive, strength-based way of individualizing our care to the young people and families that we serve. Trauma-informed and responsive really recognizes that the vast majority of young people who touch the justice system have experienced some type of trauma or adverse childhood experience, and we have to shape our approaches accordingly. We have to prevent re-traumatization. We have to address the trauma that exists. And by the way, this includes with the workforce, the juvenile justice workforce also experience trauma, and we have to do everything that we can to support their well-being as well. We know the impact of positive relationships and stability on young people. Research shows us over and over again that young people who are connected to pro-social, caring individuals simply do better. There's a whole body of research around resilience and how young people overcome adversity. And what that body of research shows is that the one common element of young people who are able to be resilient, who are able to overcome hardship, is that connection to pro-social caring adults. And so thinking about family in an expansive way, in a broad way, so we can build those positive relationships becomes important. And you'll hear from Clint Lacey to talk about credible messengers, which is part and parcel of this approach. It's such a critically important dimension. Youth and family-centered pieces. We need young people and families to be meaningful partners at the table to really drive the way that services are planned for and delivered in juvenile justice. We know that young people and families are the true experts in the system, and we have to position them to be partners with system officials and staff. And then finally, this notion of coordination. This really speaks to the need of working across systems and in partnership with communities and young people and families in order to meet the needs of young people and families. Looking at the reality that young people and families may touch multiple systems, and so we can't operate in siloed ways. If we want to maximize our system resources and lessen burdens on young people and families, we have to come together across systems to serve young people. So again, we could delve for multiple hours into each of these principles, but at a high level, this is a useful framework. And it's particularly useful as we think about the progress that we've seen in Connecticut and the link to each of these principles in the work, and as we think about the path forward as well. So with that, thank you, Marc, for the opportunity to provide that overview, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. Yeah, that was really terrific, sort of to help set the frame here. And I know that you covered a lot in a short amount of time, but I know there was a lot more, particularly in that report. I commend that report to folks, and maybe we'll come back a little bit towards the end and talk a little bit more about some of those particular principles. I'm really thrilled now to be able to turn to Tiana Davis joining us. Tiana is the terrific policy director for equity and justice at the Center for Children's Law and Policy. Really fantastic to have you with us, Tiana. I'm wondering, Tiana, as you share your thoughts, including your experience working with other jurisdictions and what you see playing out across the country, if you can help us think a little bit about the larger context that we're in terms of how we're having this conversation and how various dynamics that impact kids and families who come into the contact with the justice system sort of play out. So with that, really thrilled to turn it over to Tiana.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you all for having me join today. I'm really honored to have an audience, and I really appreciate the Tau Youth Justice Institute and the opportunity afforded for me to speak here with you all today. So as Mark indicated, there are so many challenges that have befallen our young people in our communities as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. And it's really difficult to talk about anything that we are doing in our communities or any policies and practices that we are engaging in without having that conversation around how the pandemic has impacted all of these aspects of our communities. So, I really think it's important, and if we were together in a different context, I would really be inviting everyone to check in. It's so important in these difficult times that we are really checking in with each other in our work, in our personal lives, and in our travels through our communities. It's really important to know sort of where we are. And we often ask, how are you doing today? And the initial response is always, I'm fine. But in reality, if we each take a little bit of time to think about how we're really doing in this context of the pandemic and all of the calamity that has arisen around it, I think we all can recognize the ways in which the pandemic has affected us. It's changed our behavior, it's changed our communities, it's changed our families in untold ways. And we're going to be dealing with the ramifications of this event as we move forward. And I think we understand now that there will be a new normal. There's no going back to where we were before, and we will all need to adjust accordingly. And so I wanted to just share, I did a little digging around just to see sort of what the state of things is in Connecticut. We all know that there have been impacts in job losses across the country, around the world, but I wanted to know exactly how the pandemic has affected folks in Connecticut. And what we see, as we've seen in other places across the country, the pandemic has been a major shock to the labor market, pretty much wiping out all of the job gains that the state had achieved since the Great Recession. We see substance abuse on the rise. I think there had been a 2% increase in the sale of alcohol across the state, but almost a 9% increase in the sale of spirits. So wine and beer usage has remained somewhat steady, but we've seen a huge increase in the sale of spirits. We've also in Connecticut seen significant numbers increasing in fatal drug overdoses from about 15% from when compared to 2019. So there's some significant challenges facing the community in Connecticut. Also seeing staggering increases in domestic violence, all at the same time. Funds, resources are being slashed for those types of programs that can be helpful in those types of situations. And we know that with the trauma of the pandemic, and I think it's safe to acknowledge that this has been a traumatic occurrence for everyone. It's hard to imagine anyone escaping some impact of this pandemic on their lives, livelihood, and or families. And so it's really important to check in with each other, check in with adults in our community. But I really wanted to focus in today on who's checking in with Connecticut's children. Again, you see here so many headlines that I was able to gather just doing a little research on Connecticut and the impact of the pandemic on young people in your communities. And I'm really, we're seeing these same trends in other places around the country, and the children of Connecticut are no exception. What we remember when everyone from Coca-Cola to Bank of America was reminding us that these are unprecedented times. And even though our corporations are no longer reminding us of that on a daily basis, it doesn't make it any less so. We know that it's really difficult to overstate the catastrophic impact the pandemic has had on our children and on society as a whole. And so just looking at some of the key impacts in child welfare, we know that we see significant reductions. I believe about 63% it was estimated at the beginning of the pandemic, reductions in the number of calls to the child abuse reporting hotline in Connecticut. We also know that because of shelter-in-place orders at the beginning that have come and gone and wavered each quarter as we move to a different phase of this pandemic, we know that over 13,000 at-risk children who were under the supervision of the Child Welfare Agency were left in their homes. And so without the critical supports that the Child Welfare Agency and community-based providers are able to provide for young people in those communities. Education. We know, I don't need to tell you all about the significant disruption in education and the challenges that continue in creating a safe environment for young people to engage in in-person learning. And then the digital divide. We know that 38% of residents in 5 big Connecticut cities do not have wireless broadband at home, which is creates a significant challenge when everything that we are needing to access comes through a wireless signal. And when you don't have that wireless signal, the sense of isolation and the reality of isolation and separation from all of the things that we know are important for young people creates even greater challenges. And I think all of this has culminated in a significant increase in behavioral health challenges for our young people, for your young people in Connecticut, and the lack of services to respond appropriately to that increased demand. It is trauma, and young people have developed significant needs as a result of this trauma, just like many of us adults have as well. And so just to review, we know that there are factors that place young people at greater risk for becoming involved in unlawful behavior and that protect or promote resiliency among young people as they respond to these circumstances. And if we look at this graphic here, we see the children are just kind of hanging on by a thread, because if you note all of the things that we see on the protective factor side are things that we know have been disruptive for our children over the course of this pandemic. And then if we take a look at what we see on the risk side, we know that there have been shifts in family stability, community stability, increases in poverty, potential increases in family violence as represented in the data that we saw earlier from that headline, poor nutrition, young people. There's been an increase in food insecurity among Connecticut's children. So all of these factors really come together in a way that creates a dynamic for young people where they're really hanging on by a thread. And that's young people who had advantages and had resources prior to the pandemic. And what we're seeing is that as a result of the pandemic, those young people and those communities that were already on the margins of society, already experiencing the impact of disparate policies and procedures and resources on themselves, their families and communities. We're seeing all of those risk factors compounded by the trauma of COVID-19. And so just to point out, there have been well documented the increased incidence of COVID in communities of color. It's also been well documented the increase of severe disease and mortality among people of color. And there's also an increased awareness of the structural and systemic inequities that have led to those increased incidents and mortality among people of color. And when we look at the ways in which those realities translate to impact on our children, we see even more challenging realities. Young people dealing with grief for having lost a parent or lost a family member or lost a friend as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, the fear and anxiety that comes along with the increased instability. I think if many of us adults are honest, we've also experienced fear and anxiety as a result of this pandemic. And when we compound that with the food insecurity, the strain with the schools, the disconnection and isolation that young people experience, not being able to tap into those services that they need in their communities, we see a situation where young people, as we reference back to those risk and protective factors, are now presenting with a different and more challenged risk profile as it relates to their engagement in unlawful behavior and potential involvement with the justice system. And one thing that we really wanted to underscore as we had this conversation today is that punitive legal system responses simply do not work. We know this. This is not, conjecture. This is not an educated guess. This is demonstrated through evidence. And in fact, evidence, as Marc and Michael laid out, evidence that Connecticut itself has experienced over the last many years. And so now is not the time to engage in knee-jerk reactions that will lead to harsher punishments and incarceration, because we know from that experience is that will only lead to increased recidivism and reduced public safety. So when we think about the children whom those types of regressive policies will impact, we know that the greatest burden of that impact will be borne by young people of color and their families and communities that were already on the margins of our society. So everything that was already in place, the disadvantage that existed as of March of 2020 has been increased because of the experience of trauma and the realities of our current society dealing with COVID-19. And so to avoid that impact, to avoid further negative impact, to avoid further marginalizing young people that are already operating at a disadvantage, really encourage policymakers and folks who are practicing in our youth justice systems and other community supports in Connecticut to be sure to use the data to move toward a better direction. employ the strategies that Michael outlined and that Marc outlined, that Connecticut has already been engaged in to stay the course. Focus on youth well-being, invest in communities, especially in communities of color that we know had already been in struggling in many ways, and now are struggling in new and different ways because of the pandemic. And one thing I think is really important to point out, we think about community-based services as an alternative, but it really should be the first line of the work that we do to support young people and their families. Family and community should be, and we know is the most effective response for young people. So to the extent that we can invest there, and we know that so many communities stepped up to the plate when government was trying to get its feet on the ground with this pandemic, communities stepped in and made it happen and kept families propped up as well as they could. And I think that resource, this experience, knowing that that's a resource, we should double down on our efforts to invest in those ways. And finally, focus on equity, because again, if we don't focus on equity, we know that the disparities will continue, and we know that those disparities may often even grow, particularly with some of these more punitive and harsh policies and practices that Connecticut has stepped away from previously, and hopefully the state will stay the course to support its young people and families. And again, my name is Tiana Davis. I'm with the Center for Children's Law and Policy. If there is anything that we can do to support the work in Connecticut, we've worked in Connecticut on racial and ethnic disparities for many, many years in the past, and would certainly love to revisit all of the work that had been done and that is ongoing in Connecticut to support young people, families, and communities with a focus on equity. And with that, I will hand it back over to Marc.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tiana. That was really, really helpful and instructive. I think as you were talking, I was thinking this is like the current reality check, right? Like where young people and families are sort of, dealing with situations on a daily basis. So I really appreciate the way you sort of frame that for us. I also appreciated the shout outs you were getting in the chat. Really nice. So, and I'd encourage folks, feel free to give those shout outs, but also feel free in the chat to ask questions, and we'll try to get to those as well. So thanks again, Tiana. We'll come back to you, I'm sure, during the conversation. Now I'm going to turn to Lael Chester. Lael is the director of the Emerging Adult Justice Project at Columbia University's Justice Lab. I know Lael has a wealth of experience, particularly working in New England, Massachusetts, as well as in Connecticut. She's doing really groundbreaking work at Columbia right now at the Justice Lab, and thrilled to have Lael join us. Let's see if you're up on the screen. Yes, there you are. Good to see you, Lael. So I wondered, you've got experience in so many different jurisdictions and sort of grappling with these issues over time. And as we know, sometimes when we grapple with these issues, there's unfortunately some misinformation out there. And sometimes we even see, policymakers, sometimes some quick reactions to what may be sort of in the headline of the day. We see this in jurisdictions across the country. And so I'm wondering, Lael, if you could talk a little bit about maybe what are some of the most common myths, and how can we have research and data help guide us forward? It's something that Connecticut, I think, really should be commended for in its work over the years. But it's a constant challenge, I think, particularly in this day and age with social media and things moving so quickly. So I wonder if you could share a little bit of your thoughts in that regard as we continue this conversation.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Marc. And I'm so happy to be here with the wonderful panelists. And all the participants. I would like to start with sharing two of what I think might be the most common myths about the juvenile justice system. The myth number one, which I think a lot of you will, this is not going to be news, but is that imposing harsher penalties on kids is an effective deterrence. So this myth ignores the research that we know about adolescents and even older youth up to age 25. They are risk takers. They're heavily influenced by their peers and less future oriented than older adults. Until they mature, they tend to act in the moment and ignore future consequences. This is what you've heard from other speakers as well. But the myth also ignores the research on trauma and harm caused by prosecuting and sentencing children as adults and the consequential higher rates of recidivism. So as you know, and again, as you've been told, the justice system responses must be fair, effective, and developmentally appropriate. This is what leads to positive youth outcomes, and this is what leads to public safety. So the second myth that, on my list is that the juvenile justice system, the quote, kiddie court, fails to hold youth accountable. In fact, the juvenile justice system can be more burdensome than the adult system, with more oversight, accountability, and services. This is why many public defenders oppose raising the age of juvenile court jurisdiction to 18 in the states that had an age below age 18. They believed quite rightly that the youth would have more programming and oversight in the adult system. The juvenile system is individualized and focuses on rehabilitation. Instead of just punishing, the juvenile system seeks to address the root causes of the behavior and to support the healthy development of the youth. Not only are recidivism rates lower in the juvenile system, but youth grow up to be contributing members of our communities. And I noticed that one of the questions in the chat was, how do we measure success, right? Recidivism is one instrument, but the other instruments are things like safe and stable housing, education achievements, meaningful employment, not employment, that the research is very clear. We need meaningful employment for youth to grow up, age out of crime, and desist, and to be healthy adults. So of course, there are many other myths. For example, one that I hear frequently is that victims want punishment. I began my career as a victim witness advocate in a prosecutor's office and learned firsthand that this is far from true. Victims vary tremendously in what they want from the system, but there is one thing that is consistent. They do not want what happened to them to happen to anyone else. As a result, we owe it to victims to ensure that our responses are effective and based in research and data, not in harmful myths. As you've heard, Connecticut has been a leader in this country on the various improvements in the juvenile justice system. Marc went through a long list of impressive improvements and reforms, including raising the age from 16 to 18 to being the first state to do that, and having it be fully implemented in 2012. Due to the thoughtful improvements in the juvenile justice system, Connecticut has enjoyed decreases in caseloads. When I wrote a report for Connecticut's Juvenile Justice Policy and Oversight Committee in 2016, I reported that over a 10-year period from 2005 to 2015, juvenile arrests had declined by 67%. Juvenile dispositions were down 34%. Juvenile detention decreased by 38%. And juvenile sentenced to what was then DCF, but to confinement went down 54%. And all of this happened at the same time that Connecticut was raising the upper age of juvenile jurisdiction. From 2016 to 2018, the average daily population of youth under 18 in DOC custody has declined from 73 youth to 57. Right? This is all great news, but there's more to be done. Right? Connecticut prosecutes and sentences youth under age 18 as adults, a practice we know to be ineffective and unfair. It actually decreases public safety. It does not increase it. And Connecticut, like most states, struggles with stark racial disparities. Looking at the population of young people at the Manson Youth Institute, 15% are white, 85% are youth of color. So to wrap it up, Connecticut must be guided by data and research, not controlled by myths. We know what works. This includes diversion, restorative justice, positive incentives, using a positive youth development framework, and opportunities to grow up and to mature. These are what we want for our own kids, and it's exactly what we should want for all kids. These are not in line with the traditional get tough criminal legal system policies, but they are in line with research, and they must be a priority if we want a fair, effective, and a developmentally appropriate youth justice system. It's important to remember, right, as we achieve positive youth outcomes, we ensure public safety. So myths in the juvenile justice system are strong, they're resilient, and they're sustaining. All wonderful characteristics of people, especially youth, but dangerous when designing and implementing effective youth justice practices and policies. Turn it back to you, Marc.
Great. Thanks so much, Lael. Really, really helpful. Yeah, we hear a lot of those myths out there, so it's good to hear sort of the reality of what the research and what good policy looks like. So really appreciate the way you framed that. So we're going to move on now to our last speaker before we get into time for a Q&A and some discussion. I'm really thrilled to be able to welcome Clint Lacey to join us. Clint is currently the president and CEO of the Credible Messenger Mentoring Movement, also known as CM3, which is a recently launched organization that Clint is heading, building on work he's been doing in DC and other jurisdictions around the country around credible messengers, which I'm sure we'll hear from more from Clint. Also, Clint most recently served as the director of the district's, Washington, D.C.'s Juvenile Justice Agency, so has real experience there, as well as I know from his work in New York about systems change sort of on the front lines. So really happy to have Clint join us. And Clint, if you can, maybe starting off, we know, and we've talked about the fact that this is hard work, right? Many challenges, working with many of the most vulnerable children and families who come into contact with the system. Tiana talked about how hard that was before COVID and the additional stresses that families, children, and communities are facing. And in some ways, sometimes I think it can be overwhelming, right? And almost scary to think about the challenges. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, positive steps that we can do to make our systems most successful in really helping young people and families, and why we can or should be encouraged, if we should, and what we have to look forward to as this work continues. And I know you've implemented a number of strategies in DC and New York and the work you're doing now. So I wonder if you could share a little bit of that. So, just reflect a bit. There are a lot of challenges, but should we be encouraged as we move forward? Really interested in your thoughts.
Thank you, Marc. It's really a great question. I appreciate the way you framed that. And first of all, I just want to say thank you. I'm really honored to be part of this conversation with the distinguished audience. And of course, and participants, and obviously the distinguished panel, all of whom have, I think, done such an excellent job of sharing important information and also framing these issues in such a clear way. And so there's not a lot more to be said. I won't go too long here because so much rich information and data and policy, insights, policy informed through experience has been shared. And so I just want to build on that a little bit. I do think we should be encouraged. I think that we are continuing in what has been a long process, a long struggle. I was a history major, so I tend to think in terms of long term, even centuries in a way, but I think it has been over time, over generations, a real progression. I think it's fair to say with struggles and victories and sometimes setbacks. But I think we're moving in a direction to build a healthier, a more effective, a more loving practice of justice, of youth justice that positively impacts young people and families while promoting and contributing to wellness and safety in our communities, public safety. And so those two things are certainly not mutually exclusive, but in fact, I think go hand in hand, that the connection between not just positive outcomes for youth and families, but what helps to drive that. And I think one of the things that helps to drive it is what's been mentioned a few times in this conversation. And, I heard Michael say it, which stood out when he's talked about being youth and family centered, and seeing youth and families, and I would extend that to communities as experts, as those with knowledge, with insight, with expertise that has great value, and that if leveraged, if tapped into, if invested in, can continue to have a really transformative impact on some of the biggest challenges that we have, on some of the things that have been most harmful and negative about the system that we continue to change. And so there is evidence of that. We've been talking about data throughout this conversation. And I think the good news is that many of the innovations and those tried and tested approaches over time are effective, are true, are real, are in fact making a positive difference in outcomes and contributing to public safety by all key measures of what keeps people safe, what makes communities well, what allows our children and our grandmothers and people to walk the streets and go to school and do the things that we all want in all of our communities. I think that, over time, there's been great progress with regards to the reform efforts and innovations in methodology with regards to the youth justice system. And so there's certainly much to celebrate with regards to the lifting of standards, the defining standards, of improving conditions, of creating and building alternatives, quote unquote alternatives, which hopefully will become the norm, not the alternative to incarceration, bringing education and behavioral health to populations that are impacted by the justice system. There's been tremendous amount of work done, a great amount of knowledge generated, published, put into practice. I do think one fair critique of the reform era, though, still begs this question, or points to the need for a greater infusion of youth and family and impacted community voice and insight and perspective into this idea, not just of reform, but really of reimagining what our justice system can look like, reimagining what our processes can look like. And I think that to give the greatest opportunity to this reimagination and rebuilding, right, and creation of a system that's more effective in all the ways that we think it should be, that we can't do that without the insight of those most impacted. And for too long, and in too many instances, even good reform measures, I think, have lacked or missed out to significant degrees that key ingredient that we'll keep repeating, of youth and family centered voice. So I think that one of the questions is, well, what does that look like, right? Certainly to those few who want to hold on to the more punitive, destructive aspects of the justice system will find this quite threatening. But I think that people who are really serious about improving the system, who are really serious about positive outcomes for young people, who are really serious about safe and well communities, while it may be a bit daunting, perhaps a bit uncomfortable, it being this infusion of community voice and participation, I think that that those of us collectively, broadly speaking, can grapple with those issues, with those challenges, particularly if we're able to unpack them and clarify what do we mean and what does this work look like. And so what I'd like to talk about for a couple of more minutes is what does community voice, impacted people voice look like, right? And so as we move through our progression, through our historical progression, I think we're right at the point where we've begun to see examples of a shift on reliance, sole reliance or predominant reliance on traditional systems and those who run them and those who work in them as the people and the place and the source and the location of a healing or restorative or a rehabilitative process, a shift that creates space for community voice to occupy some of that space, not just as recipients of a kinder, gentler, smarter brand of justice, right? Not just recipients, but participants in defining that process. And so our work beginning in New York City at the Department of Probation, where we, among other things that we did to engage community, to create space, to legitimately open up, to be transparent, to listen and apply insight and expertise from community, we launched Arch's Transformative Mentoring, which essentially is now known as Credible Messenger work, and invested in the most impacted communities that led the population on probation, but also the sources of incarceration, juvenile and adult, throughout the state of New York, and invested in those communities and invested in particularly people who were rooted in those communities, who shared life experiences, who had been impacted by the system, who had overcome those circumstances, and who were made conscious decisions that they wanted to be part of the solution of healing, of engagement, of positive youth development, and also of reimagining and recreating justice systems that had greater fairness, equity, and more positive outcomes. And those are what we call credible messengers, people who for too long have been marginalized and written out of the conversation, to incorporate them into the conversation. And in New York, they became the front line of those serving and working with and spending time and being available 24/7 to our highest risk population on probation, 16 to 24-year-olds, the majority of whom were there on felony charges. Well, long story short, the Urban Institute did a study that showed an unprecedented reduction in recidivism of 59 and then 60%. That's public safety. That's drastic decrease of people engaged in quote unquote delinquent or criminal behavior, going to jail, being rearrested, right? And being positively engaged in their communities. And so for me, credible messengers for us represents, that's a practical, tangible example of what do we mean by increasing community participation? Well, in that instance, it meant that probation officers had to create space at the table for credible messengers to be central and in fact, often on the front line of engaging people who probation officers were responsible for supervising. So we took this initiative to DC and really expanded it, began to serve whole families with credible messengers. But we did one other thing that I'd like to mention before I close briefly. We took this idea a bit further and said, yes, credible messengers can have measurable, dramatic impact, positive impact on system-involved young people, those who were quote unquote high risk or most vulnerable, and have drastic decrease of recidivism. In DC, we experienced a 50% reduction. But in addition to that, we had the opportunity to literally and figuratively move credible messengers into the building, into our agency. So now they were at the table, not just serving young people, but engaging with staff and leadership around programs, around policy, right? Around how resources were being used and allocated in the community, being trained in positive youth justice and trauma and healing-centered engagement, and having a positive, infectious impact on the department on the culture. And if there's one thing I'd like to close with regards to the good news, as Marc asked, is that we have clearly awesome expertise. We have methodology, the positive youth justice framework, trauma-informed, healing-centered, I could go on and on. The knowledge is there. The data is there about the effectiveness of approaches. But what I think is probably most critical or important is that the culture supports the embedding of policy that includes and relies on our community partners. You need a culture change for credible messengers to have their greatest impact. We need a culture change for community voice, right? Those most impacted to have a positive contribution to our process. And we've seen examples of it. And I think that ultimately, as they say, the proof is in the pudding and the evidence is being generated as we speak. And we have great data already that supports this idea that if we can widen the table and include community partners, even those who traditionally we didn't view as partners, we can have a positive impact. And the good news is that it's happening. And we're hopeful that there will continue to be an investment in communities to be at the table and help redesign and reimagine what the table can be.
Wow. Thank you, Clint. I needed that, man. I'm feeling encouraged. I mean, all the speakers, it really was sort of gives us, just a wealth of information about how we can think about these issues. And I really appreciate the way you framed that at the end there. So I'm feeling good and energized. I hope folks are as well, and particularly as we jump into some Q&A and some discussion. I think we're going to have the other speakers join us back on the screen. And just to start it off, Clint, maybe I can go to you first. We actually had a really good question in the chat, seeing if I could find it, from Tony Walker. Thanks for being with us, Representative Walker, who's one of the champions and leaders of the reforms in Connecticut over the years. And her question is, and Clint, I think you started to answer this a little bit, but her question is, how do you debate anecdotal stories which feed fear and hate? And as she said, public safety seems to have only one side. But I think you were suggesting a way to sort of address that. It sounded like both through data and our own stories, particularly the people who you're working most closely with. So I wonder if you can kick us off by responding to Representative Walker's question about how do we respond? There's always going to be some bad cases, right? Some stories. How do we respond to that and not cede the ground where sometimes it feels like, public safety there's only one side to it? If you can, share your thoughts a little bit about that, and then we'll get to some of our other questions and speakers as well.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the question. Really important and very difficult, right? To how do we engage this and not get caught by the extreme anecdote, right? That then becomes the narrative, right? So how do we build narrative? I think one of the ways that we do it, in addition to data, evidence, right? But still, there's this sort of perception narrative struggle, even though we got so much data and it continues to generate. So in addition to that, I think it is being very intentional, confronting, not just confronting, but beginning to not run from, to the extent that any have ideologically, but own the public safety message. Like not getting caught in this sort of old soft on crime, tough on crime trap, right? But really moving beyond that and saying, no, we value, we care about, we are passionate about, we are focused on public safety. We are focused on victims, harmed parties, impacted people. Like we confront that issue. And in our restorative work, our restorative work is about restoring people who have been hurt, people who have been harmed. It is about confronting those issues and having honest, truthful dialogue and discussion about what is the ramifications, what are the outcomes, what are the consequences of these issues, right? And really just claim that space, I would have to say. But when I say claim it, enter it, right? And shine a light of information of experience, of evidence, right? And so I think that's one thing that we have to continue to do, and not be marginalized as somehow out of the conversation, right? So I've been on calls, we're all on thousands of calls and working in jurisdictions, and somebody who, an official said, yeah, well, this is all very nice about the youth, and we want good things for youth, but what about public safety? And and the answer was, no, this is public safety. Right. This is very much so. So how do we continue? I guess I'm stating the obvious, but how do we strategize in terms of messaging, narrative building, and really owning and not running from that message, I think.
Yeah, I love it. No, that's super helpful. It made me think, so we've got a number of questions in the chat. I'm going to encourage our panelists to take a look, but also I'll try to do that as well. And as we continue the conversation, just on that last piece that Clint was talking about, I wonder, Tiana, if I can go to you. I really like the way you broadened the discussion, and a number of our speakers did. I love the way you talked about the risk and protective factors, right? And really, to me, what I heard was, what Clint was just saying, like, this is about public safety, right? When we have to address risk factors, and we have to think about the assets that people already have, those protective factors. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, particularly the notion of well-being. How do we think about sort of well-being in this context of justice reform and public safety? I mean, I know myself, I've got 2 teenage kids, and I feel like I'm thinking about that all the time. Just basic well-being. How do I keep them productively occupied, particularly in this world we're living in, right? So I wonder if you could just share your thoughts a little bit about that as we think about this wider conversation about public safety.
Sure. And I too am the parent of a 14-year-old
I know
boy,
you
and this pandemic has put people into a place where nobody's really living their best life, right? Because of the circumstances that we're in. And I think, I take a lesson from sort of the shift that we've seen among many people in their personal lives and as individuals, where there's an opportunity. The change has happened. We are now living in a different world. And there's an opportunity to, as we build it back, like Clinton noted earlier, we need to build it back better. We need to build back a system that works for us. We need to build and invest in communities so that we don't need systems to work for us. I think there's this question of well-being. We have approached youth justice reform, I think, largely from a harm reduction perspective, right? How do we keep young people out of detention? How do we keep young people from engaging in arrest? But I think there's a next level to this conversation, and that is, how do we ensure that young people are thriving? How do we ensure that young people are having access to what they need in order to grow to their fullest potential? And the question of public safety, the answer is right there, as we heard earlier. Well people, healthy people, happy people who have their needs met do not engage in unlawful behaviors at the same rates. And so we have to find ways to build on those protective factors, build on those elements in our communities, in our families, and in our young people that enhance their sense of safety. Young people should feel free from harm or the threat of harm in their social and physical environments. Young people should feel stability. And we have a little ways to go, because again, the current situation set us back a little bit, but we will get there, and I'm confident that we will. And young people need nurturing, whether that's in a community, whether that's in a family setting, or it's an extended mentor, extended family member, or the like, build on those strengths and resources to the benefit of the young person. And I really appreciate Lael's sort of outlining the myths of the youth justice system. And one myth that I think is important for us to recognize is that there is the myth that only some young people are deserving of that, are deserving of safety, are deserving of stability, and are deserving of nurturing. And that myth, I think, is often at the root of the disparities that we see in our system. All young people deserve those things, and it's our responsibility as adults and as government to provide it for them.
You know, I really, thank you, Tiana. I really appreciate all of what you just said, particularly that last point. And actually, I wonder, Lael, if I can go to you and encourage folks also to look at the questions in the chat and encourage folks to put questions in the chat. While we're doing that, Lael, you know, Tiana just talked about that last point about, you know, sort of who may or may not be deserving of sort of our proactive responses. And you talked a little bit about some of the myths, including the myth that all victims just want people locked up for a long period of time. I know also there's been, I think, good discussion and conversation in the field about the fact that we shouldn't think that all victims look the same, right? And that sometimes there's an image in the public of what sort of a typical victim looks like versus we know the trauma and experiences a lot of the young people in our families experience. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, about what does the research show us about sort of victimization and how young people experience that, which I think we don't often hear, particularly in sort of mainstream media conversation. I wonder if you could share a little bit with us about that.
Sure. Yeah, it's you know, it's upsetting that the most vulnerable people in our communities tend to be people of color, people facing poverty, have the highest rates of victimization. And I think another aspect that we often, so that is those communities that are most impacted all the way around, right? They're more likely to be victimized, they're also more likely to be system involved. A colleague of mine, Bruce Western, has done a lot of research looking back at people during reentry, trying to get the experiences both before system involvement and during system involvement, and now trying to establish themselves in the community. And the level of trauma that people have experienced is shockingly high. They have either been shot, they have witnessed shootings, they have witnessed deaths. Very young people have, you know, fortunately in my lifetime, I have not witnessed someone die. It is actually a regular occurrence for people who are system involved. And so I think that you know, there's often this dichotomy of, you know, the system and the victims. The victims have become part of the system, not because they wanted to, but they are involved in the system. They too can be traumatized by the system, right? And so that's a major problem. But again, the bottom line is they just don't want it to happen again. You know, they're really scared it's going to happen again. So they want the system to work in a way that's effective. And they want it to be fair. And I think that sometimes, you know, we bant around and we forget to listen to them, and we forget to hear them. I would just say one other thing, which is, you know, we often skirt around the issue of violence. You know, we talk about, you know, system involvement. And I think it's, you know, one way sort of a light bulb came off in my head was, in many ways, the justice system just displaces violence. There's violence in the community, it displaces it from behind the wall, and then it goes back into the community. And so, you know, a big piece of dealing with the justice system, and everyone's touched on this, is investing in communities, right? Starting right there to provide them the support and the opportunities that other communities get to enjoy. But a lot of them don't. And those are the communities that are victimized. And those are the communities that are losing their community members to the justice system.
Great. Super helpful. I see we've got a lot of great questions in the chat. There's no way we'll get to all of them. I'm wondering, maybe, see this question, maybe to you, Michael. The question is, can you shed some light on what has been learned about kids who are transferred to adult courts? Is it good for public safety or the kids? You can talk maybe a little bit about that. I think maybe we'll have time for one more question, but that might be the last one. So turn it to you, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I see that Clint has responded in the chat as well, maybe just to us, but I do agree with Clint that, transfer to the adult system, by and large, of young people has been a failure. I think ultimately what we're talking about here is to advance a developmental approach and really position young people to succeed. We have to be focused on skill development through education, through other pro-social opportunities. And we have to be focused on relationship building, right? Making sure that every young person is connected to a caring pro-social individual who will support them throughout their lives. How do those things happen? If those are the core tenets of a developmental approach in advancing positive youth development, skill development, and relationship building, how do we do that? By transferring a young person to the adult system where they're subjected to a different philosophy, different approach, with more punitive and correctional in nature than, as compared to what the ideal juvenile justice system. And that's not to say that there aren't juvenile justice systems that, don't operate with that, punitive mindset. We're working to change that, really emanating from what the research tells us to do. But I think it does run counter to our goals. Ultimately, embracing the narrative around community safety and public safety is right on. And if we really are invested in that, then we really need to be asking the question, how do we support young people and families to do well in the long run? And by simply sending young people to the adult system in that way, that's just not the way that we will achieve it. Now, we'll continue the conversation about accountability and repairing harm. The pieces that we've been talking about here, really investing in restorative justice. I see that there have been questions in the chat about restorative justice. That's where we need to take, our work to speak to that. But by and large, I think that, transfer really, it runs counter to this developmental approach that we've been talking about and we know works.
That's great, Mike. I couldn't agree more. I think the other thing I would add before we close out, and a number of our speakers, you guys have all touched on this. When I think of it in this context of the question about kids going into the adult system is, again, disproportionately, we're talking about young Black and brown young people. Here in DC, where I am, literally 100% of the kids who end up incarcerated and going into the adult system are Black and some Latino, but mostly Black. And here where I'm raising my kids, and I've said this in DC before, I don't even think folks could imagine if we close our eyes for a moment and imagine that the disproportionate number of kids locked up in adult jails and prisons were white, middle class, and upper class kids. It's like we can't even, that would never be a reality that would be allowed to happen, right? And so the fact that we allow it to happen is I think, directly connected to the kids who it's impacted. And so I think and I just want to, share that reflection as we close out. I want to thank all of our speakers, just a tremendous wealth of knowledge. We were not able to get to all of the questions, but I think the Tao Youth Justice Institute are terrific on follow-up. I'm sure they'll figure out a way to do that. I want to thank everybody who signed in today to listen for this important conversation. The work continues. There's no question. We had a wealth of information. I'm pleased to be encouraged by Clint's remarks and that there's so much we know and how we can have successes in this work, which Connecticut really has over the years. So hopefully that will continue. And with that, again, thanks to everyone. And I think I'm going to turn it back to Erica of the Tau Youth Justice Institute, and she'll close us out. So thanks to all of you. Really a pleasure to be with all of you today.
Yes, and thank you, Mark. Thank you to all of our speakers. I'm so excited. We have spent so much time together planning for this panel, and I'm just very proud of the message that was sent out. And I really do think that has laid out sort of the messaging for where we want to go in our legislative session this year. Again, I want to thank each of our panelists, and just a quick heads up that we will be releasing our next webinar shortly, and so please look out for that. And in regards to the questions that we did not get to, we will be putting out some information out there around those responses. But thank you again to everybody who participated, and to our panelists. We truly appreciate you. Thank you.